The night the Soviets arrived in Cold Bay didn't feel like the start of a secret alliance. It felt like the world had tilted sideways just enough to make every man wonder whether he'd stepped into the wrong war. The Americans waited on the pier in heavy parkas, boots sunk into the slush, breath rising in white clouds. Behind them, the base lights glowed dimly against the mist, outlining warehouses, fuel tanks, and the long, dark shapes of ships that weren't supposed to exist under this sky. Then the Soviet transport ships appeared, huge, dark silhouettes emerging from the fog like ghosts that had traveled too far and weren't sure they were welcome. Their hulls groaned as they approached the dock. Their anchors hit the water with a deep, echoing splash. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the Americans, not the Soviets, not even the gulls circling above the bay. The two groups stared at each other across a few feet of frozen planks, future enemies, present allies, bound together by a war neither side could win alone. The Soviets stepped off the gangways stiffly, shoulders high, eyes narrow. Many of them had never seen Alaska, never seen American sailors up close, never seen the ships they were supposedly here to learn to command. One Soviet lieutenant paused at the foot of the ramp. When he looked at the American vessels moored behind the pier, sleek hulls, fresh paint, modern weapons glinting under floodlights, he understood immediately that nothing about this place matched what he had imagined. These weren't aging patrol boats or hand-me-down auxiliaries. These were frontline machines, far ahead of anything waiting for him back in Vladivostok. And in his mind, a quiet realization settled. No one gives away ships like these for free. Not in this war. Not in any war. Across the pier, American sailors watched the Soviet crews step onto Alaskan planks for the first time. Rigid backs, guarded eyes, faces set in practiced neutrality. They didn't look curious. They didn't look grateful. They looked determined, almost grim, as if already bracing for the work ahead. To the Americans, the message was just as clear. These men weren't here for friendship. They were here to learn fast, and they needed to, because the Pacific wasn't going to forgive hesitation. Between the two groups lay Cold Bay, isolated, frozen, and about to become the most improbable naval school on Earth. The Soviets looked around at the camp, the water, the ships, the faces watching them. They had crossed an ocean to stand here. But none of them understood yet just how strange the next weeks would become, or how this forgotten place in Alaska would shape the last chapter of the war against Japan. This was Cold Bay. This was Project Hula. And its first night was only the beginning. Long before the Soviets stepped onto that pier, the idea behind it had been drawn on maps inside rooms, with closed curtains and locked doors. Europe was collapsing. Berlin was choking in smoke and rubble. Hitler's regime was weeks from death. But the Pacific was still a grinding, bloody machine. The Japanese Empire still held the Kuril Islands, Sakhalin, and the waters brushing northern Japan in a tight, fortified grip. American planners knew the arithmetic too well. If they had to invade every island alone, from the south and east, the cost would be catastrophic. They needed pressure from the north landings, mine-sweeping, patrols, a whole new front. And only one country could do that. The Soviet Union. At Yalta, Stalin had named his price and his timing. 90 days after Germany fell, he would turn east and enter the war against Japan. The words sounded firm. Promises on paper always did. But those same planners had seen the reports from the Far East Fleet. Old ships, thin training, minesweepers more at home in the 1920s than in 1945. If they attack with what they have, one American analyst wrote, they will bleed for every mile. So Washington made a decision that felt, even at the time, like something out of a story nobody would believe later. Train the Soviets, arm the Soviets, and hand them a small navy built in American yards, on the condition that when the war was over, every hull came back. They drew up lists: sub-chasers, minesweepers, patrol craft, landing ships, tugs, more than 100 vessels in all. Enough to sweep channels, escort convoys, support landings, and seal off Japanese garrisons in the north. But they needed a place to do it. Somewhere remote, somewhere ugly, somewhere no journalist or curious fisherman would stumble onto a pier and ask why there were suddenly Soviet crews on American decks. Cold Bay, a forgotten inlet at the far end of the Aleutian chain, too windy for comfort, too isolated for smugglers, perfect for secrets. The Soviets weren't told everything. The Americans weren't told everything. But the outlines were clear enough. Live together, train together, race the calendar, and get ready to hit Japan from the top, while the rest of the world was watching the bottom. The first morning at Cold Bay felt less like the beginning of a partnership and more like trespassing. The Soviets woke in unfamiliar barracks that smelled of damp wood and disinfectant. The wind rattled the thin walls. Somewhere outside, an engine coughed to life and settled into a steady rumble. When they stepped outside, the base felt unnervingly ordered. Fuel tanks arranged in precise rows, piers numbered, signs stenciled, cables coiled with the kind of neatness that suggested someone checked them twice a day. Back home, bases had grown wherever there was room and a need. Here, everything looked built for purpose. "This doesn't look like a war zone," one Soviet sailor muttered. "It looks like a factory that builds navies," another replied. They formed up in ranks along the pier, boots cracking the crusted snow. Across from them stood the Americans, caps down, hands behind their backs, eyes watchful, not friendly, not hostile, just weighing the men they'd be handing lethal machinery to. Then the Soviets saw the ships properly. Minesweepers with coils of gear on the stern that looked like something out of a technical manual, not a dockyard improvisation. Guns with smooth traverse, barrels shining even in the weak Aleutian light. A petty officer stepped forward without meaning to, eyes locked on a subchaser's hull. An American chief noticed. He tapped the painted number on the bow. "That one's yours," he said. "By the time you leave, you'll know every bolt in her." The Soviet didn't smile, but something shifted in his face, curiosity cutting through wariness. "We will learn," he said. The first briefing was held in a drafty hall, whose single overworked stove kept clanking like it was protesting its orders. Maps of the northern Pacific, the Kurils, Sakhalin, and the Aleutians covered the walls. Soviet officers crowded onto wooden benches, notebooks ready. American instructors stood at the front with grease-stained fingers and diagrams rolled up under their arms. The translators struggled under the weight of technical language, tripping over words like fuel manifold, sound-powered phones, escorting formation. The Americans shortened their sentences. The Soviets listened harder. When words failed, hands took over. An open palm pressed down toward the floor. "Keep her steady here." A finger running along a pipe. "Check this daily." A sharp tap on a lever. "This will kill you if you treat it wrong." It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. Outside the hall, the bay sat gray and cold. The ships shifted slightly against their lines, as if impatient. Training began the next day. The wind whipped across the water, turning exposed skin raw. The Soviets marched in rows down to the piers, coats buttoned to the throat, hats pulled low, eyes fixed forward. The Americans were already on deck, waiting beside open hatches and unlit engine rooms. The first lessons weren't about tactics, they were about familiarity. Walk the deck, count the hatches, learn every ladder and companionway in the dark. Know where you can grab if the ship lurches. "Don't think of her as American," one instructor told his Soviet group. "Think of her as stubborn. Treat her right, she'll get you home. Treat her wrong, she'll drown you." On the surface, the guns waited. The first time a Soviet sailor took hold of a 40mm Bofors mount, he tested its movement cautiously, expecting weight and resistance. Instead, the gun swung smoothly under his hands, tracking left and right as if eager. He tried again, faster. The barrel followed. He glanced at the American instructor, who gave a small nod. "Don't fight it," the American said. "Guide it." They practiced elevation, tracking imaginary targets in the fog, loading drills until the muscles in their arms burned. Casings clattered across the deck. Commands were shouted in Russian, counted off in English, checked in both. Breaks between drills were awkward at first. Cigarettes helped. An American would light two, pass one over. A Soviet would accept it with a short, stiff nod, inhale and stare out at the water. In the mess hall, the strangeness doubled. Long tables filled with 2 languages and 1 menu. Americans swallowed their food and left quickly. Soviets sat with their caps on their knees, tasting dishes they'd never seen before, and pretending not to be surprised by the abundance. One afternoon, a crate of Coca-Cola made its way into the canteen. The Soviets eyed the bottles suspiciously. An American popped one open, took a long drink, then raised his eyebrows as if to say, "See? Still alive." A brave petty officer took a bottle, tipped it back and nearly coughed it out as the carbonation burned his throat. The Americans laughed. After a moment, so did he. The fog began to lift, not just over the bay, but between the men. Storms helped. When the wind howled too fiercely for drills on deck, everyone crowded into workshops and passageways. Men from both sides huddled around the same stove, hands extended toward the same heat. An American mechanic gestured at the rain blasting the window. "That's a real Aleutian hello," he said. "In Vladivostok," a Soviet replied dryly. "Storms don't bother to say hello." A few chuckled. The world didn't change. But the room got a little warmer. The work never stopped. Engines came apart and went back together. Mine-sweeping gear was explained and then explained again. Navigation teams traced routes through charts, learning to convert American markings into Soviet practice. By late spring, Cold Bay no longer felt like a construction site. It felt busy, alive, like a machine built to turn strangers into crews. The day the ships officially changed hands, the bay was eerily calm. No snow, no rain, just a low, featureless sky and water so flat it looked wrong. American sailors lined one edge of the pier. Soviet crews lined the other. The ships sat between them, tied off, engines quiet, flags still American. An officer from the U.S. side read out the transfer orders, with the stiff formality of a man who understood exactly how unusual this was. "These vessels are placed under your operational control for the prosecution of the war against Japan," he said. "They are to be maintained, used, and safeguarded as if your own. Upon cessation of hostilities, they are to be returned in accordance with agreement." He handed the documents across. A Soviet captain took them without hesitation. Then came the part no one wanted to screw up: the flags. American sailors climbed the masts first, hands steady on cold metal. The stars and stripes came down slowly, folding and furling with practiced care. No speeches, no music, just the soft rasp of fabric and the clink of halyards. Soviet sailors stepped forward with their own flag, a red field, hammer and sickle bright even under weak light. They raised it briskly. It snapped taut in the breeze and settled into a slow, lazy ripple. For a heartbeat, both crews watched it as if expecting lightning to strike the mast. Nothing happened. An American petty officer broke the tension first. He stepped closer to a Soviet gunner and nodded toward the ship now flying the Soviet Jack. "She's a good hull," he said quietly. "Treat her right. We will fight with her," the gunner answered. His English was rough, but his meaning was clear. "And we will bring her back, if the sea allows." Engines came alive, one by one. The ships eased away from the pier, wakes spreading out in bright white fans behind them. American instructors remained aboard a few vessels as observers. Most watched from the docks as the line of hulls turned toward open water. It felt, to some of them, like watching their own ships leave for a war they weren't invited to. Leaving Cold Bay was the moment when everyone learned the difference between training and reality. The first swells hit not long after the last scrap of the base disappeared behind fog. They weren't high at first, just heavy, long, rolling hills of water that made the hulls creak and the deck plates hum. Men new to sea duty gripped railings. Veterans planted their feet and pretended it was nothing. Then the weather worsened. Wind built from a nagging push to a full shove. Waves steepened, darkening under low clouds. Spray hammered the bridges. A minesweeper rode up a swell, hung there for a strange, weightless second, then crashed down hard enough to make the entire ship shudder. In one subchaser's engine room, the noise doubled. The pistons beat a rhythm through the floor, Loose tools rattled in drawers. A Soviet engineer checked the gauges so often his eyes stung. On the bridge, the captain squinted through glass, spotted with salt and rain. "Hold formation," he said. "Keep station by sound if you have to." Then came the fog. It didn't drift in. It slammed shut. One moment, the nearest ship was a clean silhouette. The next, it was gone, swallowed by a wall of white. Sound changed. The ocean lost its horizon. Up and down became ideas rather than directions. Radios crackled. Orders came clipped and calm. Reduce speed, check distance, stay in line. A few hearts jumped at the first near miss. A sub-chaser slid out of the mist, uncomfortably close on the starboard side, her bow cutting across the lead vessel's wake before she corrected and pulled away again. But the line never broke. Men on deck called bearings. Sonar teams listened for anything that didn't sound like their own ships. Captains trusted the drills they'd sweated through in Alaska. Hours later, when the fog finally thinned and the fleet reappeared on the open water like ghosts solidifying, they were still in formation, staggered, battered, soaked, but together. An American observer on one of the escorts let out a low whistle. "They're not just passengers anymore," he said. "They're crews." By the time the Hula ships reached Soviet ports and took on more men, fuel, and orders, there was no doubt what they were for. They weren't for parades. They weren't for show. They were for the Kurils. The Sea of Okhotsk welcomed them with a different kind of hostility than Alaska. The water was darker, colder, flecked with sharp ice even in late season. The islands rose in jagged silhouettes, volcanic ridges, bare slopes, a few stubborn patches of green clawing at the rock. Headquarters didn't waste time. American-built ships, Soviet-manned, were folded straight into plans for amphibious assaults, sweep channels, hunt submarines, suppress coastal guns, escort landing craft into narrow hostile bays. For the Soviet sailors, who had spent months on the other side of the ocean, it was a strange switch. Yesterday, they had been students. Today, they were the spearhead of a campaign that most of their countrymen wouldn't even hear about until long after the war. The first time they caught something on sonar, it was almost a relief. On the screen, a faint repeating echo appeared, too steady to be random, too shallow to be a quirk of the bottom. The operator called the contact. The captain stepped closer, eyes fixed on the green glow. "Submarine," he said. "Probably Japanese. Range closing." No one panicked. The drills from Cold Bay unspooled automatically. Turn. Set depth charges. Count the seconds. Release. Explosions thumped through the hull. For a few long moments, the only sound was the ship's own heartbeat, the grind of the screws, the rush of water along the hull. Then a heavier blast ripped upward from below. Oil bloomed on the surface. Bits of debris followed, bobbing among the spreading slick. The crew didn't cheer loudly. Just a few shouts, a few claps on the back, a few tight smiles. They'd killed an enemy they never saw. The ocean had accepted their admission. But the real test waited at Shumshu. From a distance, the island didn't look like much. A serrated line of hills, some low clouds snagged on the peaks, dark rock sloping down into a restless sea. There were no cities, no landmarks. No sense at first glance of how much concrete and steel and firepower had been buried into that coastline. The Hula fleet approached in faint light. The sky caught between night and day. Transports followed in their wake, packed with men who'd been told this was the last battle they would have to fight. The sea was choppy but not yet wild. The air smelled of salt and something else, smoke drifting in faint gray trails from hidden positions ashore. For a few eerie minutes, nothing happened. The ships closed the distance. Guns stayed silent. Marines and riflemen lined the rails, eyes straining to pick out trenches, gun pits, anything. The first shot from shore broke, that stillness like a snapped cable, a flash somewhere among the rocks, a shell streaking out over the water. It slammed into the sea in front of a transport and erupted in a column of white spray taller than the ship's mast. A second round burst closer. A third went long and howled past a sub-chaser's bow. Then the whole shoreline lit up. Artillery poured fire down into the bay. Machine guns raked the waterline. Mortars thumped from positions the Soviets couldn't see, only feel in the tremor of impacts. The Hula ships moved on reflex. Subchasers swung broadside to shore, Beaufort's mounts already traversing toward the muzzle flashes. Within seconds, they were hammering the cliffs. 40mm shells walking up slopes, chewing through rock and timber. Minesweepers added their own guns to the barrage, rails and decks shaking with each recoil. On the transports, ramps dropped. Men splashed into frigid water, stumbling toward black sand that turned slick under their boots. Some fell, some didn't get back up. Others clawed their way forward, heads down, trusting the barrage behind them to keep the worst of the fire pinned. Radio traffic turned frantic. Battery at Northern Ridge still firing. Beached transport under direct fire. Requests suppressing fire, bearing. A Hula subchaser took the risk and crept closer, spray slamming its bow, shells throwing geysers around it. The captain didn't waste words. Forward, closer, give them everything. His gunners obeyed. They poured fire into a knot of rocks that had been spitting flames non-stop since the first wave hit the beach. It took dozens of rounds. The hillside erupted again and again. Finally, one blast hit just right. A magazine, a fuel dump, a bunker, it didn't matter. A larger explosion tore through the position, and the guns there fell silent. Infantry on the sand felt the pressure ease, like someone had loosened a strap around their chest. The landing at Shumshu wasn't neat. Boats grounded on unexpected bars. Men were shot in the water. Coordination frayed under the weight of currents, confusion and the raw shock of facing fortified slopes at close range. But the Hula ships stayed in it. They adjusted fire as spotters on the beach called in corrections. They shifted positions under incoming shells. One minesweeper took a near miss that peppered her starboard side with shrapnel, shredding railings and punching holes through superstructure. The crew dragged wounded below, patched plates as best they could, and stayed on station. By mid-morning, the Soviets had a foothold. By afternoon, they had guns of their own on captured ridges. By evening, Japanese resistance had broken into pockets. And offshore, crews slumped behind their guns and on engine room benches, eyes red, ears ringing, uniforms stained with salt, oil, and powder. They had taken American steel and Soviet will and pushed them into one of the last hard corners of the war. They expected more. More islands, more sweeps, more landings. The Pacific was large enough to hold a dozen Shumshus. Instead, the war ended almost between breaths. It didn't come as a thunderclap on the ships. It came as a message, flat, official, transmitted over frequencies that had carried nothing but tactical noise for days. Cease offensive operations. Prepare to suspend hostilities. Further instructions to follow. On some decks, men thought it was a trick, a Japanese ploy to buy time. On others, officers quietly pulled out folded newspapers and pointed to rumors that had trickled through in glimpses. Cities destroyed by a single bomb. Negotiations, ultimatums. A second message followed. Clearer, final. Japan has accepted surrender terms. The ocean didn't change color. The sky didn't brighten. The guns didn't magically cool. The men didn't suddenly feel lighter. If anything, the quiet that followed felt heavier than the noise. For the sailors of the Hula fleet, the war had been short and sharp. They'd arrived late, fought hard, and now, just as they were hitting their stride, someone had reached over and flipped the switch to stop. They cleaned guns that wouldn't fire again in anger. They went back to drills out of habit. They watched the shoreline through binoculars, half expecting the order to resume to crash through the speakers. Instead, another kind of order came, not shouted from a bridge or scribbled by a harried staff officer, typed, formal, cold. In American channels, the phrase was simple. Transferred vessels are to be returned after cessation of hostilities, in accordance with agreement. Returned. The word ripple-dippled through the fleet like a chill. On one subchaser, a young officer read the line twice and frowned. "Returned?" he said. "We have just started using them." His captain, older, more tired, stared out at the gray horizon. "We always knew they were borrowed," he replied. "We just pretended not to think about it." Soviet sailors grumbled openly. They'd lived on these ships. They'd sweated into their decks, bled on their ladders, trusted their engines in bad water and under fire. To them, the vessels felt earned. But somewhere far above them, far beyond Cold Bay, Shumshu, or the Kurils, men in offices were pulling on a different set of levers. The common enemy was gone. The alliance was already cooling. Suspicion, never fully absent, thickened with every day of peace. The same ships that had symbolized cooperation yesterday now looked on paper like bargaining chips, assets, leverage. The Americans sent lists, hull numbers, conditions, expected dates of return. The Soviets stalled, negotiated, argued. "We crossed an ocean to learn these ships," one Soviet officer said grimly. "We took them into battle, we lost men on them, and now they say put them back in the box." On the American side, planners pointed at the agreements. Lend-Lease was a loan, not a gift. The war had ended. Budgets were tightening. New enemies, new worries were already filling reports, stamped with fresh dates and different colors. To the sailors, it didn't feel like strategy. It felt like someone walking onto a dock and asking for memory back. In the years that followed, some of the Hula ships were indeed returned, tired, battered, sometimes stripped. Others weren't. They slipped further east into Soviet service, repainted, renumbered, their American origins buried under layers of red and gray. By then, the Cold War had a name, a vocabulary, a logic that seemed to stretch backwards and overwrite the recent past. In that new narrative, there wasn't much room for images of Soviet and American sailors sharing cigarettes in the Aleutian rain, or of U.S. officers patiently explaining pump seals to men who would one day wear the insignia of a rival power. Project Hula went quiet, not with scandal, not with dramatic destruction, just with silence. It survived in fragments. In the memory of an American instructor who remembered watching the Soviet flag rise over a subchaser he'd helped commission. In the diary of a Soviet petty officer who was still amazed, decades later, that he'd stood on U.S. soil and learned to run a foreign engine. In photographs stuffed in envelopes, men in different uniforms standing together on the same deck, squinting into the wind, not quite smiling, not quite frowning. Most history books didn't mention Cold Bay. When they did, it was a single line, a statistic, a footnote with a number attached. But history has its own tides. Long after the Soviet Union broke apart, researchers opened boxes in archives that hadn't been touched since the 19th. They found schedules stamped secret, training rosters, ship transfer forms. They found maps of the Kurils annotated in 2 languages. They found photographs where an American chief pointed at a radar display while a Soviet officer leaned in to see. Piece by piece, the outlines of Hula emerged again. Not huge, not world-shaking, but unmistakable, a secret naval school at the end of the earth. More than 100 ships built in one nation, fighting under the flag of another. A fleet born in fog and dismantled in frost. Today, Cold Bay is quiet again. The barracks that echoed with voices in 2 languages have mostly fallen in on themselves. The piers have sagged, the fuel tanks are empty. The wind still scours the same hills. The fog still rolls in fast and thick, merciless way it did in 1945. If you stood there on a gray morning and listened hard enough, you might almost hear it. A fleet born in fog and dismantled in frost. Boots thudding on wet planks at dawn. Engines coughing to life and settling into a deep, even roar. Orders shouted over the wind, half in English, half in Russian, all shaped by necessity. 2 flags snapping on 2 different masts, both facing the same cold sea. Project Hula didn't win the war in the Pacific. It didn't topple regimes or redraw borders by itself. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clean. It was mud and diesel and exhaustion, men from 2 suspicious nations trying to keep up with a calendar that didn't care how uncomfortable they were. But for a brief, sharp moment at the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history, it did something almost impossible. It put Americans and Soviets on the same deck, pointing at the same coastline, racing toward the same enemy, and trusting that the man beside them, regardless of which language he cursed in, would know which valve to turn when the engine screamed, which lever to pull when the guns jammed, and which heading to steer when the fog closed in. Then the war ended. The alliance cooled, the world divided. Cold Bay went back to being a forgotten inlet on a rough stretch of coast. The ships rusted, were scrapped, or served under names that meant nothing to the men who had first walked their decks. But the story is still there, just beneath the surface, like a wreck in shallow water waiting for the right tide. A secret naval school, a borrowed fleet, a partnership born in necessity, finished in silence. And one of the strangest, most human chapters of World War II that almost no one knows,